Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, here with us, and good afternoon to our online audience. Welcome to our first seminar in the beautiful Turks and Caicos Islands. And to those online, I really wish that you were here with us in these beautiful islands. Today, we will discuss how we can better incorporate the Sustainable Development Goals into the budgeting process to accelerate development. The bank, as you know, is steadfastly working to help our member countries close the gaps to the SDGs. This seminar provides an opportunity to examine how we can do that better. Today, we have brought together a diverse group of panelists with varying expertise to discuss strategies to better focus on achieving the SDGs. We will begin by sharing some thoughts on how our region can improve the integration of the SDGs into their budgetary processes through performance-based budgeting. This will be followed by an engaging interaction with the global team we have assembled. Our four panelists will share their own thoughts on the commitments, demands, and challenges associated with the remaining 7-year pursuit of Agenda 2030. Our first panelist is the Honorable Penelope Beckles Robinson, who will open discussions. The CDB Director currently serves as Minister of Planning and Development and a Member of Parliament in the government of Trinidad and Tobago. She will examine how we can align the SDGs to national development plans and the mechanisms for successfully engaging I would like to share some thoughts on how we can drive a more focused approach to achieving the 2030 agenda. At the bank, we recognize and are moving with deliberate haste to strengthen regional and national efforts towards achieving the SDGs. The two most recent progress reports on the SDGs indicate that the distance to the SDG targets widen, mainly on account of the economic and social fallout arising from the COVID-19 crisis. This widening was felt disproportionately more so among poor and vulnerable communities in developing countries. The 2022 Sustainable Development Report showed that the indicators facing the largest divergence from targets were SDGs 1, no poverty, 8, decent work and economic growth, 11, sustainable cities and communities, 12, responsible consumption and production, 13, climate action, 14, life below water, and 15, which speaks to life on land. Given the setbacks and the distance to SDGs, we believe that the regional governments need to enhance their approach to planning for national development by not only targeting SDG areas for program-based budgeting, but rather by targeting SDG results through performance-based budgeting. While program budgeting seeks to classify lines of expenditure to specific interventions, performance budgeting is concerned with goals and targets aligned with national priorities and the SDGs. It is this next step, we believe, can create significant efficiencies and lead to better results. Many of our BMCs are aligned or initiated processes which link development plans with the SDGs. However, there's a need for effective mapping of expenditures to targets, and this would help to improve resource allocation. We're not speaking here of an overhaul of existing parliamentary budget systems and government structures, but rather of complementing these with mechanisms to monitor, measure, and evaluate investments with respect to targeted economic, social, and environmental objectives. This would allow for more efficient management of public financial resources. Such assessments would allow this framework to complement the budgetary process and engage, inform, and educate stakeholders on achievements, needs, and shortcomings. Achieving these improvements necessitate the enhancement and reformation of the development planning structures across 4 priority areas: national planning, budgetary programmatic structures, performance evaluation systems, and accounting harmonization. National plans are essential for identifying development priorities and for anchoring strategic planning and budgetary expenditure. Embedding the SDGs as the targets underpinning the planning process would be an important step in improving the planning approach. Budgetary programmatic structures should be adjusted to group allocations of spending under thematic SDG areas rather than according to the spending agency. A performance evaluation system should exist that monitors key performance indicators under a structured matrix that targets outcomes. Of course, this would also require the strengthening of data collection and reporting systems. And finally, there should be accounting harmonization through an integrated system of accounting that enables budget allocations to be monitored according to spending and the location of beneficiaries. The region is well on its way to successfully completing the first priority area. Indeed, more than half of CDB's BMCs have explicitly tied the SDGs into the targets of their national plans. In fact, in Jamaica, a rapid integrated assessment of the country's national development plan and the SDGs highlighted a 91.3% alignment between the country's internal targets and the relevant SDGs. In this case, Jamaica identified 115 SDG targets applicable to its reality. Likewise, in Trinidad and Tobago, the SDGs are instituted as anchors under the National Development Plan. The central government has detailed some of the project activities that are meant to satisfy the requirements under its pillars in the National Development Strategy, and by extension, how these will help to achieve commitments under the SDGs. Now, both Jamaica and Trinidad and Tobago consider the implementation of a system of results or performance-based budgeting as a critical step. In charting the way forward, both countries have emphasized the importance of evidence-based and results-based management, including a closer alignment of the SDGs in the monitoring and evaluation framework. Furthermore, results-based budgeting has been identified as an area for capacity development, with a need for policy coherence that builds on the theories of change required for the SDGs and their role in national development plans. This process would allow for the design and implementation of strategies and programmatic interventions, including policy and accelerators that will drive the successful achievement of the SDGs and country-specific development outcomes. Through this process, authorities would be better able to match resource allocations to appropriate implementing agencies and build a more transparent, accountable, and efficient delivery of services that are in line with prevailing development objectives. Additionally, rationalization and prioritization of expenditures in alignment with development outcomes are critical. The process is meant to improve efficiency and effectiveness of service delivery and to better align spending to the socio-economic needs of the population. This activity requires detailed and timely data and statistics to evaluate and inform decisions around expenditures, areas of need, and areas of highest beneficiary reach. As such, it is critical for the planning agency to establish benchmarks and continuously monitor the successful implementation of reforms and the returns, either financial or in terms of lives and livelihoods, bettered and uplifted. To do so, a results-based budgeting framework is critical, where there can be transparent and honest reporting on the successes and shortcomings of activities. As a response to the need for an improved results-based budgeting process, national development strategies need to target the implementation of a public finance management reform strategy to improve fiscal transparency. This includes the transformation of the public sector chart of accounts, a medium-term integrated fiscal framework, and the implementation of an integrated financial management information system. Through these investments, the country can engage in more proactive budgeting by placing greater emphasis on its national development objectives. If this approach is employed, and expenditure is more closely tied to the interventions to achieve targets, the efficiency of spending and multiplier of development investments to the relevant populations can be greatly improved. Member countries, Mexico, or member country Mexico, a CDB non-borrowing member country, provides a useful example of how the SDGs can be mainstreamed into the planning and budgetary process and the rewards that can result. Under the Office of the Presidency and the National Institute of Statistics and Geography, Mexico formulated an SDG Specialized Goals Committee and mapped its budgeted items to the SDGs, clearly articulating its strategy to 2030 by weaving a large portion of its national budget into the successful implementation of activities targeting the SDGs. Through this process, Mexico linked more than 85% of its 16 SDGs into the country's budgetary program. Of these, the budgetary program had full coverage of 10 SDGs. This mapping made for more efficient use of resources and better targeting of internationally accepted medium-term goals. This process formed the basis on which Mexico launched the world's first sovereign-issued SDG bond in September 2020. The projects resulting from this bond will focus on education, health, access to electricity and basic needs, and access to water services. There are some key takeaways from the examples of Mexico and other countries. The first is that by aligning the budget process with a systematic and comprehensive set of goals that are accepted internationally, the region can improve the consistency of objectives, and such an approach lends itself to a more transparent and open process of evaluation and comparison. Additionally, it can increase the access to available finance, with many areas of the SDGs receiving significant donor attention. Furthermore, through a carefully designed strategy and close alignment with national development priorities, the theory of change for investments in national development may become more obvious in implementation, and the clear demarcation of roles and responsibilities across public sector agencies will indicate visible entry points for the private sector, civil society, and key stakeholders to become engaged in supporting the budgeted expenditures towards development priorities. As such, we believe that the region needs to institutionalize a development approach that is SDG-centered and builds on existing planning processes and embeds performance-based budgeting as part of a process of public finance management reforms. Crucial to this process are continuous public expenditure and financial accountability assessments, and investments in statistical agencies to collect, analyze, and disseminate timely, reliable, and accurate statistics for better and improved measurement and better targeting. The 5 steps are SDG and National Development Plan alignment, budgeting for sectoral interventions, regional approaches to public financial management reform, analytical studies and localizing implementation of targeted interventions. Firstly, we recognize that the concerted efforts of regional governments to strengthen their respective national development plans by harmonizing targets with those under the 2030 agenda. These efforts are critical to improving the lives and livelihoods of our populations in a sustainable, inclusive, and equitable manner. This is an important first step in the process of budgeting for the SDGs and improving the development landscape. This can prove useful in increasing access to financing and resourcing opportunities, while also providing universal method to measure successes or gaps and better target potential solutions. Secondly, the budgeting process must be a cohesive and inclusive one that not only considers the needs of all stakeholders, but also matches appropriate expenditures with the sectoral arms of government that are tasked with responsibility for the various targets. It is here that transparency and accountability can be strengthened through a budgeting process that efficiently allocates resources to the objectives under the country's SDG-aligned National Development Plan. Important as well is a chart of accounts that classifies the expenditure lines according to the prevailing national priorities that can better measure the impact of investments and the theory of change through the economic, social, and environmental gains that are made. Thirdly, there should be regional coordination, harmonization, and implementation of public financial management reforms. The fourth element relates to analytical tools that can quantify the theory of change from activities through outputs to SDGs. Implementing this broad suite of reforms at the regional level brings benefits of increased multilateral agencies' participation, shared learning opportunities, and the opportunity to build regional systems that can support continued learning and improvements. The fifth pillar of budgeting for the SDGs comes from the findings of the CDB-led training and capacity building sessions. It articulates the role of local government agencies in implementing the 2030 agenda in collaboration with ministries, private sector, civil society, and key stakeholders. These agencies are considered as the closest level of government to the people, with core responsibilities in physical and social infrastructure, environment, sanitation, and disaster management, and local economic development. Local government agencies are also facilitators of public services, and in a more decentralized reality, offers significant potential to implement national development plans at the community and household levels. In this regard, budgeting for and expenditure on the SDG-aligned national development plans can be made more effective by incorporating local government planning and implementation in achieving the SDGs. Now, ladies and gentlemen, having shared these thoughts on improving budgeting systems for the SDGs, let's bring in our experts to take us through the active agenda that is already underway. Structurally, for this to be successful, we need to have our respective ecosystems moving harmoniously together. These reforms and helping investments to reach the targeted population, finding investments to achieve our collective aims, and obtaining the necessary levels of support and buy-in needs to be cross-sectoral. Public-private partnerships, targeted financing, availability, reliability, and understandability of statistics, and commitment to open and transparent communication is a must-have going into 2030. So, to kick off the panel discussion, let me first invite the Honorable Minister of Planning and Development, Trinidad and Tobago, to share the experience of the government of Trinidad and Tobago in incorporating the SDGs into their planning and budgeting process. Minister?
Thank you very much, Ian. Distinguished governors, observers, members of the media, ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon. It's a great pleasure to be here with you today as together we take the time to reiterate the importance of the 2030 Agenda and the Sustainable Development Goals as a critical framework and tool for strengthening national policy formulation, and evidence-based decision-making. I take this opportunity to once again thank the Caribbean Development Plan for extending the invitation to participate in the eminent discussions as we seek to address the social, financial, environmental, institutional, and economic challenges in our warring member countries. As a responsible member of the global and indeed regional community, Trinidad and Tobago has given its commitment to the International Sustainable Development Agenda, and as part of this collective journey to the year 2030. Reflective of this commitment to principles of sustainable development, Trinidad and Tobago's National Development Strategy 2030 was created as a comprehensive national development framework which reinforces our commitment to achieving our 2030 agenda by ensuring that all 17 SDGs are integrated and prioritized across all national goals and objectives. As the principal vehicle for localization of the SDGs in Trinidad and Tobago, Vision 2030 is intended to facilitate a long-term process for the achieving the SDGs while remaining focused on local development needs. Recognizing the inextricable linkages among the SDGs, the government of Trinidad and Tobago has always acknowledged that progress towards achieving the SDGs cannot be the sole responsibility of the government. As such, a whole of government and whole of society approach with an emphasis on collaboration and partnerships across public sector, private sector, civil society will create greater inclusivity and synergy towards lasting sustainable development. In recognition, the need to take a closer look at the ways in which the overarching National Development Plan Vision 2030 is aligned to the SDGs, in 2017, the Trinidad and Tobago's national planning documents were assessed using the Rapid Integrated Assessment methodology developed by the United Nations Development Programme. This tool helped assess the level of preparedness for the implementation of the SDGs. Policies and plans were reviewed based on how they incorporated the principles of policy integration, no one left behind. The findings show that the National Development Strategy 2016-2030, that is our Vision 2030, the National Performance Framework and sectoral policies are aligned with 81% of the relevant SDG targets. Upon completion of the RIA, our United Nations country team fielded a mainstreaming, acceleration, and policy support MAPS mission to Trinidad and Tobago, and that was done in April of 2017. The objective of the mission was to develop a roadmap for the SDG implementation in our country. The resultant Trinidad and Tobago roadmap for SDG implementation grew from insights gained during a series of consultations with stakeholders over the course of the mission. Stakeholders consulted included ministries, civil society organizations, private sector organizations, international development partners, and academia. The roadmap is intended to serve as a bridge between the implementation of the nationally defined development priorities and the SDGs. More recently, Trinidad and Tobago has continued in pursuit of seeking to assess SDG implementation. As many of you will be aware, the UN encourages member states to conduct regular and inclusive reviews of progress at the national and subnational levels, which are country-led and country-driven. The voluntary national review serves as a basis for the regular review of the process of the SDG implementation at the annual UN High-Level Political Forum, also called HLPF. The BNR process, therefore, supports and facilitates the sharing of countries' experiences, including successes, challenges, and lessons learned regarding the implementation of the 2030 Agenda, and facilitates the identification of measures to accelerate implementation, strengthening policies and government institutions, and mobilize multi-stakeholder support and partnership for the implementation of the SDGs. In 2020, Trinidad and Tobago successfully presented its inaugural BNR on 8 of the 17 SDGs at the high-level political forum, which had the added challenge of taking place during the onset of the COVID-19 pandemic. We have currently noted that key to the BNR's success was the fact that it was a joint effort of many actors and stakeholders from various facets of the society. Overall, the BNR contributed to national awareness of the SDGs, created a baseline database of Trinidad and Tobago's implementation of 8 of the 17 Sustainable Development Goals, created a platform for stakeholders to showcase their work on implementing the SDGs, and provided an avenue for further discussions and collaboration on how to continue connecting the dots, to the SDGs. Nevertheless, we also recognize that there is yet more that can be done and must be done. However, as with so many of us, the COVID-19 pandemic did us no favors regarding our ambitions to make further and significant progress towards achieving the SDGs. Similar to many other countries, particularly small island developing states, the COVID-19 pandemic significantly impacted on Trinidad and Tobago's economy and society. Faced with widespread economic and social repercussions of the pandemic, the government of Trinidad and Tobago immediately focused on social protection measures to support people through existing programs and or new ones introduced in the wake of the COVID-19 pandemic. Social protection measures included the introduction of a salary relief grant, temporary food support, rental assistance grants, and additional support to existing recipients of food support, public assistance, and disability grants. Although the consequences of the COVID-19 pandemic continue to evolve, the tremendous lasting impact on sustainable development is undeniable. In this vein, the government of Trinidad and Tobago recognized that COVID-19 demanded a coherent policy response. The COVID-19 crisis significantly impacted on the progress made so far in achieving the targets of our National Development Strategy as well as the SDGs. In this regard, our government understood that the COVID-19 pandemic not only required responses to immediate social and economic challenges, but also required strengthening mechanisms and capabilities for organizing a sustainable recovery from the crisis, one that does not come at the expense of progress to our country's Vision 2030 and the SDGs. The wide-reaching and fundamental changes following the onset of COVID-19 and its consequences required a critical review of the prevailing policy context and development initiatives of the country. Our government understood that we were required to devise more ambitious strategies in order to mitigate the adverse dynamics exacerbated by the crisis. In May of 2020, the government established a Roadmap to Recovery Committee to develop a strategy way forward to ensure a sustainable recovery from COVID-19 crisis and build a better way forward. With the aim of taking a whole of society approach to respond to the multiple dimensions of the COVID-19 crisis, the committee comprised of experts from the public sector, private sector, labor, civil society, and academia. The Roadmap to Recovery report and the Committee Recovery report has been developed with the aim of building coherent responses for sustainable post-COVID-19 recovery. These reports aim to balance short-term economic growth objectives and long-term sustainability and resilience goals. Phase 1 of the Roadmap to Recovery report focused on articulating measures to be implemented immediately to protect the vulnerable and ensure the health and well-being of the population, and to propose initiatives to reignite economic activity and ensure social stability. What were the priorities? Those priorities including addressing and mitigating the hardships inflicted by COVID-19, restarting the economy, and laying the foundation for sustained economic recovery. Phase 2 of the Roadmap to Recovery report, with a more medium-term outlook, develop the transformative pillars for growth and strategic initiatives more fully. In so doing, it provides the framework and architecture for transforming the economy and the society. There are three main pillars of the roadmap for recovery, including transforming the economy, making food and security a reality, and leaving no one behind, making equity and empathy central. These pillars anchor and support the economic and social aspirations of the citizens of the population of Trinidad and Tobago. Our community recovery report focused on investigating, prioritizing, and recommended specific development action plans, programs, and appropriate responses for communities with at-risk youth designed to bring about economic and social strengthening and sustainable community development. The key dimensions of the community recovery report included community pride and ownership, human development, social support and cohesion, business and economic development. Certainly, it is anticipated that these areas which we have identified for targeted focus will only serve to propel us forward towards our sustainable development objectives. In charting the way forward, Vision 2030 is being reviewed to reflect the peculiar development needs arising from Trinidad and Tobago's current situation. This involves exploring solutions comprising a synthesis of recommendation from the Roadmap to Recovery and the Community Recovery Report Committee, as well as findings from the Ministry of Planning and Development review of the first five-year Vision 2030 from 2016 to date. We are also seeking to focus on the immediate socio-economic recovery from COVID-19 pandemic through the three-year public sector investment program for the period 2022 to 2024. Government, ministries, departments, and agencies will also be sensitized on the importance of aligning their capital expenditure program to government's medium-term policy and planning framework. Furthermore, Trinidad and Tobago also recognizes the importance of robust monitoring, reporting, and evaluation systems. These mechanisms are critical to assessing and tracking progress of the institutional arrangements towards the achievement of the SDGs. Strong institutional mechanisms will go a long way towards shaping sustainable policy decisions and coherent actions in line with commitments to accelerate progress and achieve the SDGs by 2030. The Ministry of Planning and Development is currently exploring the development of a national coordination, implementation, and monitoring framework for the SDGs. It is anticipated that this whole of government coordination will be effective since it will contribute to limiting duplication of efforts, promote mutually supporting action across sectors and institutions, and concentrate resources toward common objectives. Moreover, the government of Trinidad and Tobago understands the importance of data and statistics that are accurate, relevant, timely, sufficiently disaggregated, accessible, and easy to use, particularly for decision makers. We acknowledge that strengthening our statistical systems will improve our country's development by facilitating improved decision making and an increase in evidence based policies. Admittedly, within the Caribbean, statistical legislation frameworks have been described as lagging behind in entrenching some basic good practices in official statistics. In Trinidad and Tobago, the Statistics Act 1982 is a legislation that governs official statistics and represents the latest amendment of the Statistics Act, Act 26 of 1952. Our country has therefore drafted a new statistical bill, the National Statistical Institute of Trinidad and Tobago Bill 2018, which seeks to modernize and update the current legislation. The bill, which would establish an NSITT, is partway through its legislative process. The functions of the proposed NSITT include ensuring compliance with statistical standards, cooperation with regional and international statistic bodies, and providing data according to a predictable schedule for public information. Once fully operationalized, the national statistical system will be significantly enhanced in fulfilling its role of supporting the sustainable development aspirations of Trinidad and Tobago. Fellow attendees, with these things in mind, I, like you, certainly anticipate an informative, insightful, and productive session and look forward to this afternoon's discussions and questions. I thank you.
Thank you, Minister Beckles, for those thoughts. You reminded us that uh, it is very important to have continuous and extensive consultation. You also talked about promoting partnership and inclusivity. You reminded us as well that collaboration is critical, and importantly, that the pandemic set back our development. Uh, you also indicated that Trinidad has redoubled its efforts to make up lost development ground. And you told us about the way that the government of Trinidad and Tobago is responding in that regard. But importantly, you reminded us that measurement is critical. The theme of our meeting is measure better to target better. And I think that that's a very, very important reminder for us. So with that, let me invite Richard Sami now to share some thoughts with us. Richard?
Thank you, Ian. Fellow panelists, in person and online, Board of Governors, ladies and gentlemen, specially invited guests, good evening to you all, good afternoon to you all. It's really a pleasure to be here in Turks and Caicos as part of this very significant and critical discussion. And critical not just in terms of substance, but also critical in terms of timing. We have seen where we have been set back by the impact of COVID-19 on the SDG journey, and we do have to get back on that path and redouble our efforts in order to meet our targets. I'd first like to recognize CDB by showcasing this measure better to target better, because there is a critical role in ensuring that our targets are realistic, that they can be measured, that they can be linked to national development plans, and that, of course, creating that ecosystem for the public, private, and civil elements of society in order to press forward to meet these goals. I thought it would be fitting to really showcase the Republic Financial Holdings Limited story as it relates to SDG. And hopefully throughout this presentation, you will see some of the wins, some of the commitments, and also some of the challenges that we face in the private sector in order to push the SDG movement forward. All right. Just to move on, just to give you a bit about Republic Financial Holdings Limited, we are a 185-year-old organization operating in 14 countries in the Caribbean and, of course, in West Africa and Ghana. We do have an asset base of around US 16.5 billion US, and we offer the full suite of banking services throughout the region and beyond. Moving on. Republic Financial Holdings Limited, our sustainability leadership example, really came into being over the last couple of years. We would have kicked off by signing on to the UNDP's Principles of Responsible Banking in September of 2020. And we would have also been one of the founding members of the Net Zero Banking Alliance. Most recently, which we're pretty proud of, we became the first indigenous banking institution to create a Chief Sustainability Office. And that Chief Sustainability Office is, in fact, ESG-led and heavily focused on the 17 SDGs. And the 17 SDGs have been adopted throughout the entire group, where from a group perspective, we've adopted SDG 13, which is the climate SDG, as well as 17, which is related to partnerships, which we will be discussing here. But of course, in each of the 14 territories, we have asked our banks to identify at least 2 or 3 SDGs that apply specifically to those nations and, where possible, reflect the national development plans. We also have adopted 6 principles in order to shape the future progress on the SDGs, and that is alignment, impact, clients and customers, other stakeholders, governance and target setting, which we'll discuss further today, and of course, transparency and accountability, which has to wrap the entire progress. Next. We have attempted to adopt several of the main elements in order to push the discussion forward. Of course, globally, there has been materiality assessments, and we are also adopting that assessment within the group. Very important is ESG, data-driven decision-making. And one of the challenges that both Ian and the minister alluded to is, of course, timely data, data that is not siloed, data that is not just diffused, but having that integrated system in order to measure. Of course, following international best practice for tracking SDG elements, it is relatively new to the region. Globally, it would have been kicked off in 2015, but we do have to increase our adoption in order for it to be meaningful. Risk management tools, of course, we are a financial institution, and we focus not just on credit risk, but also operational risk and enterprise risk management. That will impact not just our lending, but also our investment portfolios. And then, of course, ensuring that the SDG best practices are aligned with the strategy of the RFHL group, and tying in our reporting to the principles of responsible banking, the Net Zero Banking Alliance. Moving on. And so just to give you an example of our commitment at a very high level, on the climate finance goal, we do plan to focus on lending and encouraging energy efficient projects, clean fuel usage, reduction of carbon footprint, climate resilience, loan for hybrid and electric cars. And we intend to not just share that in terms of the customers and our clients and our other stakeholders, but we do have to lead by example as well. And so we have set internal goals for ourselves by 2025 to ensure that our premises are all LEED certified, to ensure that we adopt a conversion of our traditional fuel-based vehicle fleet into hybrid and into electric vehicles, to ensure that under our diversity, equity, and inclusion thrust, that there is that gender balance, and we're focusing on at least 30 to 50% of our boards being more diverse, as well as incorporating other diversity dimensions into our measurement as we roadmap diversity, equity, and inclusion. And of course, reducing our own carbon footprint and ensuring that we measure the impact of that reduction. And as a matter of fact, we have engaged international, regional, local subject matter experts in order to guide us in preparing that transformation roadmap. It's clear that we cannot do this alone. And regardless of whether you're in the public sector, private sector, the civil sector, you do need to have that interdependencies and that critical relationship at all levels in order to drive this forward. And finally, we have already pledged and we've established a climate fund, funded initially with 200 million US, to focus on private sector companies, starting with our own clients, but of course, incorporating and offering it to all private sector clients to support their projects, to support their initiatives, to support themselves going green. And one of the elements of the program is ensuring that we do have measurements, we do have technical advisors, we do have subject matter experts, supported by a council of peers and a council of both global and regional advisors on the establishment and the management of the fund. Moving on. Very important, particularly along the measurement and the goal setting discussion, is using that smart-based approach in order to ensure that our targets are specific, measurable, attainable, relevant, and time-based. And when we are setting our targets, we ensure that these questions are rigor test the targets, and we have to justify it to ourselves, and not just for ourselves, but also for external reporting and sharing with our partners that we've signed on for the third-party agreements. I think we're going to go into the actual terms and conditions of the fund at this stage. I won't spend a lot of time on it, but I will just focus on the eligibility criteria. So we are offering the fund across all of our territories in different currencies, and they do in fact address some of the key SDGs: zero hunger, SDG 2, affordable and clean energy, SDG 7, and of course climate action, SDG 13. The criteria will address projects in renewable energy space, energy efficiency, energy resilience, sustainable land management, waste management, water, electric vehicles, eco-friendly real estate, environmental protection, and any other projects which may have those criteria incorporated, both in the private sector and also working with the public sector as well. Moving on. I also thought it would be useful to showcase the Sustainable Agriculture Credit Facility, which we would have just presented to the CARICOM member states. And again, really with a view of incorporating the SDGs into sustainability and amending and improving the way that we finance agriculture and agricultural development within the region. We have signed on to support the 25 in 5 to reduce our import bill or regional import bill, which is around US $5 billion, and really encourage the development of our local agricultural sector. So we can move on to some of the terms and conditions of this facility. Again, a pledge of 100 million US. The climate fund is already 200 million US. This CARICOM Sustainable Agriculture Facility is 100 million US, and focused really at the public sector and private sector for sustainable development, for development of defined crops, capital equipment financing, feeder roads, storage, shade house farming. And important as well is understanding that we need to move higher up and further along the value chain. In the region, we're quite good at the harvesting, the planting, the harvesting, the transportation, and somewhere along that tier 2, tier 3, where you get to the refining, the adding value, being able to capture some of the premium earnings from agriculture is where we tend to see us falling off a bit, and the international players having more control over that end product and agri-processing. And of course, coupled with this is ensuring that we do reduce our greenhouse gases and our carbon footprint. Moving on. So really important, just to wrap the discussion on ESG, is ensuring that we have our group sustainability officer work with all of the divisions within the group, and then all of the agencies outside of the bank in order to partner to push the agenda. We do see our role as ensuring that the private sector outreaches and works with our colleagues on the multilateral side, on the developmental agencies, both regional and international. And of course, important to that will be the alignment to the national developmental plans. We operate in a region that is fragmented and at varying stages of progress, from a legislation, from a regulatory, from an infrastructure perspective. But I think the first step is really ensuring that there is the will to further the agenda and ensuring that we get on the same page. And I dare say, you know, this event is one of those steps that takes us closer to that realization. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Richard. I have to say that I was expecting a little bit more commercial banking. No, you know, you're putting a little bit of fear into my heart, because I feel as though you're competing with us. No, but the more the merrier. I think that the development needs in the region are sufficiently extensive that, you know, it's good to have the private sector investing and putting their money where their mouths are. There were quite a few interesting points that you made. Just to recap very quickly, you did indicate and talk about your efforts to push the SDGs forward. You mentioned the six principles shaping the future. You talked as well, and this is emerging as a common theme. No surprise to me, but the importance of data-driven decision making. You talked about measurement being important and partnerships being important as well. Very interesting was the Climate Finance Fund, which is rooted in the SDGs. You talked about energy efficiency in that regard, waste management, energy resilience. I think our projects department has a little bit of competition. You talked about supporting the 25% in the CARICOM, 25% in 5 years, which we are also supporting. So thanks very much for that very interesting presentation. I'm now going to call on what we referred to in CDB during the last 2 years as the wall. I'm going to ask Catherine Kruger to join us and share some thoughts on this topic with us. Catherine?
Great, thank you, Ian, and thank you for inviting me to take part in this panel discussion this afternoon.
So you're muted?
No, I'm not muted. You can hear me?
We're hearing you now, yes.
Yes, okay, great. Thank you so much. Thank you for inviting me to take part in this panel discussion this afternoon. Good afternoon, Minister and other distinguished guests. I'm, of course, very sorry not to be able to join you today in the Turks and Caicos Islands, but I'm very thankful to the team for organizing the virtual connection. As Ian noted, I'm an interregional advisor at Paris 21, which is a partnership funded by international donors and organizations and hosted at the OECD, with the specific purpose of supporting countries in developing their systems for data and statistics, building capacity in statistics, and advocating for more funding and resources for statistics. Our work is demand-driven based on the needs of countries in terms of their statistics development, which means that building capacity to improve data and statistics for the measurement of the SDGs has been a key issue for us for many years. From the beginning, the issue of how to measure and follow up on the 2030 agenda was weaved into the goals themselves. How do we know how countries are doing, and how do we know what they need to develop? And now, with less than 10 years of implementation left, how do we know whether enough progress is being made? For all these purposes, we need data and statistics. But we don't only need a few numbers here and there on an ad hoc basis. The SDGs cover all areas of society, as we've already heard, and they need to be implemented in a sustainable way. So what we really need to ensure is that investment is provided to the underlying systems that can produce the data, not just ad hoc financing for doing surveys and getting data in the short term. We need to ensure that countries can build systems that can produce data in the long term. And this is often not as attractive as doing a survey and getting some good data or nice report, but is more about building the institutions, developing legal frameworks, promoting dialogue and collaborations. This was actually recognized in the goals through indicators 17-18-2 and 17-18-3, which focus specifically on the underlying statistical systems that are needed to follow up on the goals. As an interregional advisor with the responsibility for small island developing states, I've had many conversations with islands in the region regarding support to develop their statistical systems. For example, Paris 21 is currently supporting both St. Lucia and St. Vincent and Grenadines in developing their national statistical plans and improving coordination among actors in the national statistical systems so that they can provide the data required for following up on the SDGs, as well as for other international requirements and national policy needs. So very much linked to the national development plans, as we've already heard. Paris 21 carries out a survey annually to monitor how much partner funding is going into the development of data and statistics, the press report, we call it. And the most recent report highlighted that funding to data and statistics has largely stagnated over the past decade, and that despite massive increases in data demands as a result largely of the COVID-19 pandemic. This situation is even worse when we look at domestic resources, which are key to ensuring sustainability and long-term development. Donors come and go, and their funding can come and go depending on changing priorities, changing strategies, and so on. So if we are to make sure that it's possible to measure progress towards the goals in the long term, it's really key to ensure that national budgets include data as a key priority going forward. Lack of resources, both financial and in terms of staff, are one of the main obstacles facing statistical offices in the Caribbean islands today. So that's my pitch for more resources. But I want to make a second point that we don't only need more financing for data, but actually we need better coordinated and more coherent financing. Financing that is targeted based on actual gaps and needs, and that can lead to effective development. In 2021, Paris 21 launched a new platform, the Clearinghouse for Development Data, which aims to inform national funding strategies and to help countries understand how much aid they are receiving for statistics across the board, help them to plan investments accordingly, assess their funding gaps, to lobby for more resources from government and donors, and to access best practices to improve efficiency and effectiveness of investments in data and statistics. So more funding, but also smarter funding to ensure the sustainable and reliable measurement of SDGs. My final point related to measurement of the progress towards the 2030 agenda is related to the need for a systems approach if we are to meet the requirements for following up on the SDGs. As I already mentioned, and something highlighted by the Minister in her intervention, this SDGs cover all aspects of society, and therefore it's not possible for one actor to have all the information needed to monitor the goals. The press report, again from 2021, also shows us that the data landscape is becoming more and more fragmented. The COVID-19 pandemic also taught us that coordination among all industries, actors, regions, and countries is essential to informing an effective response. Without this, we end up with an imperfect, incomplete, and incomparable understanding of countries' development and ineffective and unsustainable financing. National statistical offices and ministries covering all sectors need to collaborate and join forces to provide the holistic and often cross-cutting picture of development in society. But we also need to look beyond the government sector and engage with private sector institutions, civil society organizations, if we want to measure development and make progress towards the SDGs in an effective and coherent way. So I was very happy to hear the minister mention that this is something they've been working on in their VNR report specifically. I think this point is nowhere more apparent than in the area of climate change. For example, as I'm sure we will hear from Francine Barron, who will come on after me, climate change data typically comes from a wide variety of actors. It can be environment ministries, ministries for industry and trade, meteorological institutions, but also energy companies and eventually NGOs working on environmental issues. In particular, for countries' own adaptation and mitigation policies, all these actors need to work together to provide an accurate picture. And when it comes to data, this kind of cooperation has its own challenges, such as privacy issues, data sharing agreements, technical incompatibilities, and definitional issues. Many countries are taking steps in the right direction. From the Caribbean, Antigua and Barbuda, for example, have developed a climate change data portal. And some countries have also developed SDG portals, such as Jamaica and the Dominican Republic. But many more are lagging behind. So it is essential then to include data and the development of data in national strategies to ensure that resources can be found to support the underlying systems development for providing data to measure the SDGs in the long term and to ensure a collaborative approach. So thank you so much for your attention. Back to you, Ian.
Very much short and crisp. So you made some very important points, including, of course, the what is really a theme that is now developing on the podium, which is the need to have data to measure where we are with respect to the SDGs and what we need to do as well with respect to the 2030 agenda. And you talked about how Paris 21 is assisting countries in developing their statistical programs. You also indicated quite rightly that we need more financing for statistical development, but it needs to be focused. So thank you very, very much for that. And we're going to ask the fourth panelist, who is also on the wall, Francine Barron, to make your intervention now.
Thank you very much, Ian. Distinguished governors, fellow panelists, observers, ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon. The extreme vulnerability of the Caribbean to external shocks, and particularly climate shocks, has to be fully appreciated when we talk about the SDGs and progress to 2030. There are very strong linkages between poverty, lack of prosperity, and natural disasters. And Ian indicated in his opening remarks that indications are that we are moving away from achieving some goals. And he mentioned, for example, Goal 1, no poverty, and Goal 11, sustainable cities and communities. And just to present a practical example why this is or can happen, in 2017, when Hurricane Maria hit Dominica, of approximately 31,348 homes on the island, 15% or 4,700 homes were completely destroyed. 75% or 23,500 were partially damaged, and only about 10% were not significantly impacted. This is in a country where insurance penetration was only about 20%, so you can imagine the monumental task to rebuild and repair homes. The burden fell to central government to assist people to rebuild, and added to that was the destruction to the principal economic sectors of agriculture, tourism, the impact on MSMEs and on government revenue generally. The post-disaster needs assessment predicted after Hurricane Maria that poverty in Dominica would rise to 40%, when one of the key SDGs is zero poverty by 2030. As it turns out, the targeted action of the government with support from its partners averted that, but it did see some sliding into poverty and has made it much more difficult for us to achieve the SDGs. So when we talk about achievement of the SDGs, this is the context in which we must approach that discussion. When a single disastrous event can wipe out over 226% of a country's GDP, as it did in Dominica's case. Dominica has chosen to develop an integrated approach in its development planning, which is consistent with our goal to become a climate resilient nation. We chose after Hurricane Maria in 2017 to develop a national resilience development strategy as our roadmap for sustainability and resilience. And that strategy articulates the overall policy framework of the government, which is aimed at ensuring that development is people-centered. It identifies priorities that must be pursued for sustainable economic growth. The NRDS in particular posits that building resilience into the national development planning and management process requires better and more careful preparation of project proposals, closer monitoring of key indicators, systemic reporting, and frequent evaluation of programs and projects. Using the strategy as the base document, we developed a Climate Resilience and Recovery Plan, or CRRP, to serve as our blueprint of resilience. Our plan identifies 6 key result areas, and those result areas are fully aligned with Sustainable Development Goals, with the result areas of building strong communities and a robust economy, for example, checking most of the SDG boxes. We have identified 20 resilience targets that we want to achieve by 2030. And we are ensuring that all government policies and sectoral plans are aligned to the SDGs and Dominica's resilience agenda. This facilitates not only implementation, but more effective monitoring and evaluation of the achievement of the SDGs and our resilience targets. CREED was created as a specialized agency to lead Dominica's recovery and resilience building process. And a key component of our work has been working with ministry and government departments to institutionalize resilience, bearing in mind that a resilient Dominica is one that achieves the SDGs. We developed a template for use of all ministries in developing their strategic plans to ensure alignment with our CRRP targets, SDGs, and Dynamic Dominica vision. Our Public Sector Investment Program, or the PSIP, which is the budgetary mechanism used by government for allocating funds to capital projects, is fully aligned with the SDGs and our resilience targets. Every project that is considered for inclusion in the budget must identify how that project contributes to the achievement of the SDGs and the targets in our CRRP. So one of our projects, for example, is the Housing Recovery Project, which impacts the CRRP target of 90% of housing stock built or retrofitted to resilient building codes. And this supports SDG 9, 11, and 13. We're also able to identify how many projects under the PSIP supports the achievement of a CRRP target. For example, for target 10, which is sustained, sustainable, and inclusive growth of a minimum of 5% achieved, there are 52 projects in the PSIP contributing to that target. A similar exercise can be done to determine how many projects support particular SDGs. We have found that a structured approach to resilience is necessary, and therefore a strategic planning framework was developed for the PSIP. We adopted the CARICOM results-based management system for the public sector to help government to achieve greater efficiency and efficacy of projects. This helps to enhance cross-ministerial organization and facilitates better planning for future initiatives and strengthens monitoring of targets. We spoke earlier of the importance of monitoring and evaluation, and so to ensure efficient and effective delivery of our sustainable and resilience goals, a comprehensive monitoring and evaluation system for the PSIP is being developed. And this will ensure that the PSIP is a major driver of national development. It will help promote better evidence-based policies and enhance the designs of projects and programs that support prioritization of projects and improve development results in a quicker time frame. A digital M&E platform for the PSIP would also allow for improved data collection, generation of real-time data and information, compilation of lessons learned, and conduct of regular evaluation of ongoing projects. This really is critical as one of the significant challenges that we face is the accessibility, availability, and reliability of data. And I think everybody understands that. It has been repeated here more than once this afternoon. So it's not unique to Dominica. It's a challenge that the region faces. Working with the ministries, we were able to develop indicators or metrics against which progress could be measured and the necessary data collected. And we also developed with the ministries a schedule for reporting. Importantly, we were introduced to an electronic decision support platform for strategic planning and capital allocation. And this electronic scorecard supports the operationalizing of our strategic plans. This enables us to do a number of things. The scorecard enables us to objectively evaluate and score any proposed project against strategic goals and objectives, such as the contribution of a project to the achievement of the SDGs or the CRRP targets. And this helps with prioritizing projects. It also helps our ability to track progress towards those targets, as the data captured by the ministries who are reporting regularly on the indicators can be fed directly into the scorecard so that we can monitor how close we are to achieving our targets to 2030 and where the gaps are. It also improves the ability to generate reports-related metrics. That means that we are better able to track and report on initiatives and projects, and it helps in addressing the lack of reliable data. Ultimately, we are seeking to create a center for excellence for data in resilience decision-making that will allow for data capture, analytics, and management. This will inform strategic planning, facilitate investment decisions, help in the evaluation and implementation of programs and services to improve the lives and livelihoods of persons. So I want to end now by reiterating that there are a number of factors that inhibit the ability of our small states to achieve the SDGs. And these include our inherent vulnerabilities, both external and internal, high debt, mainly related to responding to climate-related disasters, lack of fiscal space to implement reforms and undertake key initiatives, and access to affordable finance, among others. Notwithstanding all of these challenges, it is important for our countries to ensure that our planning process is appropriately aligned to the SDGs and to our resilience goals, and that we improve our data collection abilities to effectively monitor, report on, and appropriately direct scarce resources towards achieving our targets. I look forward to the discussions that will follow. Over to you, Ian. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Francine, for that insightful intervention. And it just goes to show, especially in the region, how climate affects the achievement of all of the other SDGs. You mentioned your National Resilience Development Strategy, and that was very interesting. You talked about how every project must be defended against its contribution to the SDGs, and you mentioned the whole notion and the importance of monitoring and evaluation. What is obvious to me is that we are pretty much converging around a set of common themes, even though you're all approaching it from different experiences and different sectors. What I'm going to do is that I'm going to invite the audience here, and of course the audience online, to ask any questions of any of the panelists. I think we have a mic. So you can either raise your hand or line up behind the mic. And of course, our online audience is also invited to ask any questions of the panelists. But while we wait for, I see we have a question from Sarah Valero online. And Sarah is asking, how does Republic Bank plan to incorporate resilience or adaptation into their climate change agenda, and what specific activities? Everything mentioned by the panelists was mitigation focused. I guess That's a question for you, Richard.
By a process of elimination. But
Indeed.
I think it's an excellent question, and I think it may tie to Ian's comment, even though it was a bit tongue in cheek in terms of Republic Bank operating at a different level and not necessarily the commercial and retail banking level, and perhaps we could have that conversation. And it's really a matter of drilling down. So at the public sector level, we of course continue to be a lender to regional governments and government entities, and drilling down to suppliers and companies that work with those entities. But more specifically, we plan to actually have the ESG and the SDG approach integrated into our existing model, into our existing products and services that we share and offer to the corporate, commercial, and individual clientele. And as a matter of fact, we're in the process of ensuring that SDG and ESG is not seen as a parallel strategy. We believe that it has to be intertwined into the DNA. And so, for instance, corporate, commercial individuals that are seeking, for example, that are seeking a home loan and willing to go the route of applying renewable energy will benefit from preferential terms, from preferential rates. We do have it, just to showcase an example, currently in Barbados, where there has been an agreement with the government, the tax entity, the renewable service provider, and Republic Bank, where if, for instance, an individual wants to install solar technology on their residential home that is installed by the provider, plugged into the grid, there are tax implications and rebate benefits. And of course, the bank waives certain fees, gives preferential rates. And so that is how we really reach everyone across all levels at a macro, corporate, commercial, individual level. And we also have a focus on micro, SME. We really have to ensure that this is fully integrated along the chain. And ideally, you want to get to a stage where it's utopic to have that ecosystem fully working and supporting the entire process. But really, that is how we intend to ensure that it becomes integrated into the entire business model and all of our product and service offerings.
All right. Thanks. Thanks, Richard. While we wait for additional questions, I'm going to put all four of you out on the limb, and I'm gonna ask you. I mean, look, we're all of us are heavily invested, obviously, in the achievement of the SDGs. We believe that these goals are critical, but we recognize, of course, that countries, especially in the region, are lagging. And I want to ask you, despite our efforts, all of our efforts, what do you perceive to be the probability of us reaching these SDGs by 2030? And if there are any doubts, if the probability is less than 1, what do you think needs to be done to accelerate the pace at which we are going? And of course, you can feel free to call out each other. No, I'm just kidding. I don't know who wants to take that first.
I'll take a shot, and I think we've all discussed it in our presentation. The issue of capacity building. And regardless of what your interventions are, you want to be able to measure, all countries to measure whether it is an impact reaching the sustainable development goal, and whether you're reporting. I mean, Dominica gave us some excellent ideas in terms of what they are putting in place for that. Talk about the national development strategy, the roadmap. But at the end of the day, I think one of the most important things has to do with capacity building. That has always been one of the challenges in the region. And in the budgeting process in particular, to have that alignment with the SDG. As to whether or not um, I can say what are the probabilities of us getting there. The truth is that, I mean, we are now in the month of June, and for every island in the Caribbean, I mean, your thought is June going all the way down. That's the hurricane season. And when you think about what happened with St. Vincent, with the volcanic eruption, and the fact that almost every year there's some island in the Caribbean who is likely to face some kind of impact of a hurricane, we know that they are challenging. And the question for me really is whether or not in the as it relates to the 2030 agenda, the issue of the vulnerabilities, the resilience, and the challenges that small island development face will actually be considered. We have seen that with the COVID pandemic. It's one of the interventions that nobody thought about, and it's 2 years. It's continuing 3 years, and while some countries can take the decision and say, okay, we are going to move forward regardless of what, we understand the way that we have been set back. So we, in addition to the COVID that is going to take away probably 3 years or more, we have to consider the fact that virtually every year we will have those challenges in terms of our vulnerabilities, issues of climate change, and that for me is the real challenge, and that therefore is critical in determining whether or not we are going to meet the 2030 agenda and the sustainable development goals. As it relates to taking a guess, I'll probably leave that for the banker.
Sure. Thank you, Minister. And I will probably have to run a detailed business financial model in order to produce a percentage. I won't hazard a guess. But just to add to the points that you're making, I agree certainly.
Sorry, Richard, you don't need the mic. I think
Okay,
it's
fine.
only.
I'm working, okay. Just to make the point on capacity building, I'd also like to add in there a couple of points. One is the coordination and standardization along the entire process. And that is as simple as being reflective of the legislation in order to allow collaborations, partnerships, in order to allow technology providers. Important as well is going to be digital transformation in order for all of us to get to a certain critical mass, especially if we're talking about data analytics and information sharing and target setting. And again, certainly our experience operating across 14 plus territories is that each one of us are at different stages of that digital transformation process. We're at different stages of infrastructural development. We're at different stages of supportive legislation in order to meet that 2030 agenda. And that is where I suppose it's less about the discussion of the existing challenges and more about moving towards execution and moving towards implementation. We are all aware in this room and everyone online of who we are and of what the region needs to do. And I think it's a matter of working with best practice entities that have already gone down this road and really not transplanting, but adopting some of the best-in-class techniques that can work for our region. We certainly can't do a transplant of a model into Grenada or into Trinidad and Tobago, into Jamaica, but certainly being able to customize some of those international and regional leading practices. And we don't have to look very far. We just have to look at our neighboring countries to do it. And I think that is what will be the real crux, that execution and implementation to drive us there.
Thanks, Richard. One of the things that we've been hearing certainly over the last 2 days, but even before that, in this business is about implementation challenges and capacity deficits. And I think that is certainly, I do agree that that's certainly a critical issue facing the region with respect to the achievement of the SDGs, but also measuring the SDGs. And as far as measurement is concerned, Kathy, would you like to make a comment um, on the issue of capacity?
Yeah, sure. Thank you.
No,
I
the
mean,
broader question that I posed.
sure. Yes, I don't think I would hazard to give you a figure for whether or not the probability of countries being able to meet the SDGs. But I think in terms of data, from the data perspective, we have to try always to remember. I mean, the SDGs are there for a purpose. The purpose is to improve people's lives, to really lead to development in countries. And I think the important thing from the data perspective is that countries need to own their own development. They need to understand the data. And I think this is something that Francine noted in her intervention, is that things can happen on a local level, on a national level, which can completely throw all the plans and everything that you decided to do from the beginning, into just a complete mess. So you need to be able to have robust systems that can measure what is actually happening on the ground. And this means, and I think something that the minister said, real-time data that can really be used to follow the situation for people, for people's development. And I think that these are the kinds of systems that we need to try to build. And in terms of addressing capacity, I mean, this brings in a whole range of different new capacities that are needed for I think I heard the word digitalization. We're talking about different kinds of data that can be brought into the system to actually support the kind of traditional data sets, but also something as simple as building civil registration systems, which we saw, with the COVID-19 pandemic, that these kind of basic systems are not in place in many countries, and they really need to be, if we're going to be able to see how things are going for people on the ground and really respond to the differing needs, the changing needs, and these kind of crises that come and go, and unfortunately will probably continue to come and go. So for me, I think that's really the key, actually getting these systems in place to be able to respond to the changing needs. So yeah, thank you.
Thanks for that, Kathy. Now, Francine, we talked about strategies, we talked about plans, but we also talked about vulnerabilities, and we are aware that in the region in which we live, a natural hazard event can put paid to all of those beautiful plans. I don't want to ask you to talk about the probability that that a natural hazard event is going to destroy the plans that we're making. That, I think that's a conversation for tomorrow. But let me ask you to talk about the possibility that the region, more specifically Dominica, hits the SDGs by 2030.
Yeah. Well, thank you for that, Ian. I don't know that I necessarily want to hazard a guess or suggest for the region, or necessarily even Dominica. It really depends on a lot of factors that are outside of our hands. With all things being equal, if there were no COVID, if there was no war in Ukraine, if we're not hit by a hurricane over the next 7 years left to 2030, there is a possibility that we can achieve the SDGs. Certainly, we are heading towards that in our planning. Our planning is targeted particularly at us being in a position to meet the Sustainable Development Goals. But again, this is affected by external factors that are beyond our control. But I should say to you that there are things that can be done to better prepare us for achieving the SDGs. The question of access to financing, for example, is one of the areas of great need. The access to affordable financing in a timely fashion. there are a number of initiatives that we have to undertake if we are to meet our targets. And that requires us to have access to adequate financing, whether it is to undertake initiatives that help with enhancing our resilience or infrastructural resilience, or whether it's to undertake and support our efforts at economic diversification, which is a key pillar for us to be able. We saw what happened in relation to COVID-19 and how that impacted on countries in the Caribbean that were heavily dependent on tourism. So there is an imperative for us to diversify our economies in the region, and that requires us to have the necessary financing, the necessary human resource capacity, and it requires skills development. We spoke about the digitalization or creating a digital economy that requires us to retool our people and to have and pursue a deliberate program towards establishing a digital economy. We can consider ourselves large ocean states. How do we develop in a sustainable way the ocean resources that surround our islands? So there are a number of factors that I think our countries are already taken into account, and we're already on the process of very deliberate action to achieve the SDGs. But our ability to do so can be impacted by events around us, and therefore I can only say that if we are given the space to be able to pursue some of these initiatives that many of our countries are already pursuing without these external factors impacting on us, then the SDGs are achievable. But it does require there to be a system that allows for adequate space to develop, and I perhaps will just stop here and pass back on to you. Thank you.
Seeing a very important issue you raised there with respect to access to finance, and of course access to appropriately priced finance. I think that is absolutely critical. We have a question from the audience.
Good afternoon. Lamika Williams, Department of Environment and Coastal Resources, Turks and Caicos Islands. My question is for climate action. As we talk about climate action and the SDG goals, but we also have, as small island developing states, thinking about the 1.5 degree sea level, temperature rise. We're talking about the Paris Agreement, all these things that we will have to become in line with. How do we reconcile the SDG goals as well as these other sort of requirements or necessities within our planning, budgeting, et cetera? How can we put those in perspective given our limited capacity and availability of funds?
Thank you very much for that question. Any of the panelists want to tackle that question? Any takers?
Yeah.
All right, tell you what, I'll give it a shot. Okay, you go ahead, Minister.
Of course, for a country like Trinidad and Tobago that has been dependent on fossil fuels, when we have been in the oil and gas sector for 100 years and more, and for us, therefore, that whole issue of the 1.5 and the whole issue of emissions as a small island development state, and you are considered to be, one of the, serious emitters, based, of course, on the calculation. So yes, you talk about that for a country like Trinidad and Tobago, together with the issue of the climate action, and as I talked about, the vulnerability and the resilience. So that's why I mentioned earlier when the question arose as to whether or not we are going to meet those SDG targets, especially as small island development states. I mean, have they really considered all those challenges that we face? And yes, they talk about the Paris Agreement. We have seen what has happened for COP25, how there are apparent some reversals. You look at some changes in relation when they talk about coal and the elimination. Some people are saying, well, maybe that may not have been such a good idea. So the truth is, I believe there must be continued collaboration, and the CDB has been doing a lot of work in terms of assisting with capacity building, as well as assisting a number of countries to understand this critical challenge as it relates to climate change and climate action. So I think your question is absolutely spot on. What it requires us to do as a Caribbean community and islands that definitely have the vulnerabilities every single year, that it's not scientific, it's not mathematical. And even though you have a situation where people have been able to forecast certain things, you have a wide period where you have hurricanes, and you just one morning you just hear a hurricane is coming, and the level of preparation for us is extremely challenging, especially like for an island like Turks and Caicos and others who are clearly a lot more vulnerable. So I mean, collectively, as Caribbean islands, I think we have a responsibility to take a position collectively that clearly indicates that we are not in the position like other countries that can, in some ways, easily meet their targets. And for us, it's almost as though you're reversing, and then you're going forward and you're reversing. So I really believe that it puts us in a very, very challenging situation, but it also gives us some opportunities to ensure that we make some very bold statements as it relates to the challenges that we encounter.
Thank you, Minister.
Ian, just to add to that, if I may, I think many of our
Francine,
countries, I think many of our countries in the Caribbean are looking at the opportunities available for clean energy, whether it's wind, solar, ocean, and in Dominica's case, geothermal. We have, and there's also ocean technology that one can look to as well. So there are opportunities for us to utilize clean energy, not only to meet our requirements and obligations under the Paris Agreement, but to utilize it to create economic opportunities for people as well. Where speaking specifically for Dominica and perhaps other countries like St. Vincent and probably St. Kitts and Nevis and Grenada may have geothermal and have the opportunity to transition to a green hydrogen economy. Which can be beneficial to them for their industrial development. These are areas that we can look to that helps not only in meeting our commitments, but also creating new opportunities for people as well. Thank you.
Thanks, Francine. Yeah. So the question spoke to or started with the whole notion of climate, but it also talked about the competing development needs, and I think that that is an important topic. The SDGs, of course, cover 17 goals, requiring obviously significant resources, but they're all very important. And I think that that is where budgeting processes that are efficient comes into play, in the sense that it's really about properly identifying what is necessary for the country to move from where it is to where it should be in 2030, doing all of the analysis that is necessary to identify the theory of change that gets you from where you are to where you want to be through the activities, the outputs, the outcomes, and those SDGs, and properly prioritizing your expenditures to make sure that you achieve a reasonable match between what you're spending and what you want to achieve. So I think that that's fundamental, and this is why the budgetary reforms are so critical, because ultimately resources are scarce and resources have to be used properly, right? So I think that all of those things are extremely critical, and improving the budget processes are, is very important. Let me ask Richard, though. We talked about carbon, and I know that the European Union has implemented a carbon tax, and of course, you have oil exporters figuring prominently in your portfolio. So I want to ask you, what are the potential challenges that you think are faced as a result of that carbon tax?
Thanks, Ian. I think it's a very valid and timely question. And essentially, the carbon tax set by the EU really taxes the carbon emissions or the cubic carbon emissions arising out of energy and oil producing states. And so, for instance, the countries in the region that come to mind, of course, Trinidad and Tobago, Suriname, Guyana, and within our portfolio as well, there's a tie to Ghana. I think it's going to be critical for the private sector companies operating in those industries to really get that measurement right, and that measurement will impact their bottom line and also their corporate citizenship in adhering and pushing the SDG and the ESG agenda. And in the developed world, there are implications as it relates to the value of the company, to the share price, to attracting investment, and really valuing those companies. And we have to almost adopt that type of approach in order to ensure that we adopt that responsibility that the minister was speaking to. You also have the Basel Committee on Banking Supervision that recently came out with 18 climate risks that are being put forward. And of course, while it's attracting a lot of different views from different players and stakeholders, it is the start of the conversation that we need to have in order to get to a point of policy adoption. So it will, in fact, land squarely on those operators in order to adopt that and build that into their business practices.
Thanks for that, Richard. Kathy, you mentioned the need for the upgrade of statistical legislation as one of the steps in, improving data. And I want to ask you, what has been the experience in getting countries to upgrade their statistical legislation? What are the challenges in that regard?
Yeah, I mean, I think the legal challenges to building these systems that can really work together and take this holistic approach that we've all been talking about is required for measuring the SDGs. These challenges are very real. I mean, there need to be very many things in these legislation. There needs to be a clear mandate to bring these stakeholders and data producers together. There needs to be strong enough provisions to allow access to the data that is existing, to be able to use it, to provide the statistics. The provisions need to be wide enough to allow access to different types of data. We've all spoken about collaboration, so we need to make sure that it's possible to collaborate when it comes to data. But on the flip side as well, there needs to be this strong privacy legislation to ensure that individuals and enterprises are protected, and that the trust in the institutions can be maintained. And I think, there is a very strong push internationally to look again at the legal frameworks and to see, to make sure that the legal frameworks are robust enough to support these, to support the building up of these systems. But I think the reality is that even with the strong legislation, the statistical offices need resources and capacity to be able to implement the legal provisions. So even if you have a strong legal framework. It's not enough actually to implement without qualified staff, funding, expertise. The statistical offices and other ministries who are producing data are struggling to make use of the mandate and to actually coordinate the systems effectively, to put the systems in place and to actually build the collaborations that we're talking about. When it comes to SDGs, it's quite often in other ministries and agencies who are leading the work on SDG reporting and follow-up. So the important aspect there is that the statistical office who have the mandate to collect and disseminate the data are included from the beginning and are recognized as having a crucial role to play. So I think the legal frameworks are super important, but as important, and that's what we've been hearing from the other speakers, are the finances to actually put these things in place, and also the capacity, to know exactly how they're going to put these things together, to talk to different actors, to use different kinds of data, and so on and so on. So I think the first step is possibly developing the legal frameworks, but then there's many other things that need to be in place. Thank you. Did we lose the seminar?
I think we might have.
Okay, so let's just see if we can get them back.